let's not conflate agents with sales. They can be the same thing, but if an agent adds value, they will stay in the value chain. If they don't, they'll go. Sales adds a lot of value. A very wise man once said to me, and the sentence I use it at least once a month: nothing happens until you sell something. You have the greatest ideas in the world, until someone pays you a rand for your thing, virtual or otherwise, it's not going anywhere. And my favorite reason for people leaving a business I'm a part of is for them to start their own business. And I will always try and help them, and even though it's sometimes irritating when they leave, I really believe in people starting their own businesses, so I want to help, but I always give them that piece of advice. Because in most cases, for example, with Quirk, people leaving to freelance or start their own agency, and I'd say, be aware that you have to sell. And it's a different skill. And sometimes not even a skill, it's just a confidence, but if you are really good at design, for example, and so you leave to become a freelancer, another thing that I've seen true in almost every circumstance is that the first few months, often years, of being a freelancer is very fruitful. Until you have sold to everyone you knew at the beginning. Because then you didn't really have to sell to them. They knew you, they trusted you, whether they were friends or family or what have you. Now you have to go beyond that circle. And you have to find new people who at the start are totally unknown to you. And you have to convince them. That's when it gets hard. I think the first website that we sold, was to someone I knew before. Sold my dad a website. It was terrible. But quickly, when you have to go beyond that, suddenly it's really hard. And if your skill is design or SEO, it's a different skill to selling. And often people don't realize that. The first person in a new office has to be the sales guy. It can be a CEO who can sell, but it can't be a CEO who can't sell. Because then there must be the second guy. Okay. Because everything starts with sales. And yes, often agent is a sales agent or an estate agent or something like that. And I think estate agents will not disappear, but have their margins shrunk dramatically as the internet takes over. But again, someone starts to take it over the line, and I think that's going to be there for quite a while. But I like the fact that fat gets removed from the value chain, because it's better for the consumer. I think economic destruction is really good, because it only really happens when the consumer gets better off. There's very few examples in the long term where something gets taken out of a value chain and leaves the consumer worse off. Monopolies being the exception.
What are the economic benefits to when that happens, when some of the fat goes away? Does everything sort of, should inflation effectively go down a bit or something, or what happens to?
No, price should drop or value should increase. Agents, as a broad stroke, broad term, and they're obviously many different types. For the most part, they exist because of an asymmetry of information. So, if you take property as an example, before the internet, if you wanted to buy a house, you looked in the newspaper, which has a limited set of properties, and the agent has a less limited set. And so they knew something you didn't, they could trade off that information. Now I go to Property 24, which has all the properties. In fact, if you're not on Property 24, you're unlikely to sell it. I think now the skill of an agent is not having information, which is not a skill, that's a resource. It's about negotiation, persuasion, sales, getting people over the line. If you've got two houses, and actually, if you look at it, if you just pick your average middle-class suburb, let's say a 3-bedroom house on 1,000 square meters versus a 3-bedroom house on 1,000 square meters, they're never the same because by definition they're in two different places, and therefore they're slightly different. But in many cases, those differences are not enough to justify one over the other or a higher price. It's going to be the person, the human, that makes the difference there. And in fact, the house I bought, I'm grateful to my negotiating skills, not to get me a better price, but I understood the needs of the seller, which interestingly were not financial. And through the process, I allowed her to see my needs, which was to have an amazing home for my family to grow up in. And interestingly, she wanted that more than she wanted a bit more money. Because, and I didn't know this without asking questions, what was amazing about this house is that her husband had grown up in it in the 50s and 60s and 70s. In the 70s, she got married in the garden. They then sold the house 30 years later, on a whim, her husband bought it and then died. And she didn't need money, but the thought of her, of seeing my family, which obviously I think is beautiful, growing up in this house that had a lot of sentimental value to her, allowed her to offer me a price that I could afford, and not the price she wanted that I couldn't afford. And the sentimental difference to her was bigger than the financial difference, and therefore we did a transaction.
That's
so
awesome.
it really was.
But as you said,
and actually, I mean, I didn't necessarily go into it saying I'm ask Christians to negotiate, but we just got to know each other through the process, and we met minds, and it was amazing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.